talking about the foreign policy of the European Union, security. And by the way, this is closely related to the previous panel, because as you know very well, there's good foreign policy when there is good economy. You know that this comment that European Union is an economic giant but a geopolitical dwarf, and having in mind the crisis in the Eurozone, we have to rethink its being a giant. But this is a topic you have in the folders, more information about it. And about our panelists, well, Vladimir Shopov is as a political analyst, very interesting opinions about Europe. Christu Christev was a lecturer at the University of Sofia. If you followed the European program of MoveBG, you've watched him or read his statements in previous discussion. Martin Vladimirov, he's expert on international and energy security. I'm sure you're looking forward to this discussion. And Velislav Ivanov, co-founder of Blueprint, and my name is Adelina Marini. I'm the founder of EU Inside. We've been working on European topics for many years. I'm really addicted to this job. Somebody called me a EU zombie a while ago. So let's start with the most important topic. Years ago, when we talked about the foreign policy, the European policy, European Union, all journalists left the room because there was nothing to say. But now, after the Ukrainian crisis, we all started the question, do we have a common foreign policy in the European Union? If not, how can we develop this policy? And can we agree on sanctions that we all believe are the right ones and comparable to the measures imposed by the US on Russia? And why are we talking about the European Union since everybody's deciding for themselves? So a lot of questions. I'm sure you've read many analyses about the foreign policy and the EU being a dwarf in this. So let's start with Vladimir Shopov. Please tell us, do we have a common foreign policy? Is there a crisis in this policy? Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. What I wanted to do today is to discuss the way the European Union is thinking about the visions, about how visions are created and implemented. Talking about foreign policy, this is not so much through the toolkit of sectoral foreign policy, but it's more about the fact that in the past decade we the thinking about the European Union has been very interesting vis-a-vis its attitude to the external, to the surrounding world. Allow me, first of all, to start off with two integration stories, and they are very visionary in their nature, at least the way the European Union used to create, has been creating its political reality over the past decades. First, because they have a different ending, and I want to use them as a basis to explain the changes, and the changes would prevent us from being witnesses to such integration elements. First, the first story is about the creation of the Eurozone. This is not the economic, the political, the politological story, but the creation of the Eurozone in the past few years, a lot of stories have been published of people who took part of this process, and we can talk about making a vision which from now on will be impossible to implement. I mean that we're in a situation that in which there is a core of group of people with a clear political idea, and they obviously didn't manage to convince other people in this idea. And we know empirically now, on an economic level, we know many people were against this type of integration. So we have to be more technical. They did not support the idea that the monetary union is the peak of the economic integration, the climax, and not an initial impulse to create a closed cell in which European economies would have to integrate later on. The European Union managed to impose this political decision, but in the previous panel it was mentioned that in this way the institutionalization of this vision for the future, it led to the underestimation of all the components in this monetary economic union that are intrinsic to its existence, and that is filling the gaps with those components, the fiscal union and so on. The second example that is rather unsuccessful, and we are witnesses of this. This is the European Constitution, about the attempt to draft a European Constitution, which was a demonstration of the same type of political culture of developing European integration. That is, a group of political figures proposed a long-term vision for the development of the Union through the perspective of their own analysis about where Europe should be in 15 or 20 years' time. But this time, in this case, this model of developing integration was disastrous, and it collapsed because of the differences in which political systems are functioning. I'm using those two examples to illustrate the key link that we need to take into account when talking about what the European Union should do from now on. And this is the link between leadership, legitimacy, and vision. In other words, those that analyze what the European Union should be doing, if they have to do it in a legitimate way from the perspective of the European citizens. So we have have a triad of relations without which the European Union would hardly be able to build and to create what it will be doing in the future. So if we start to see the situation, the challenges that the European Union should be addressing, we can outline several evident processes and contexts. Well, of course, the first one is globalization. What is happening as a result of globalization? What is happening to the European Union after the first crisis of globalization, an unexpected crisis of globalization, at least from the perspective of the West? The second process is connected with the long-established perception that in the new global world in the 21st century, the EU should be a homogeneous player, irrespective of how it is the way it is coordinating the different policies. And the other process related to the crisis, a process that we are becoming aware of right now, the crisis was actually a lesson in interconnectedness, and it was probably surprising for many European politicians. But in other words, this is the process whereby the Union, from now on, will be trying to bring to a logical end those lessons, morals, and needs of additional integration or stopping integration in some of the sectors. Why, however, is this model of negotiating European integration not possible anymore? The first thing is that this model is mistrusted already, and this can be seen not only on the level of citizens but also elites. The second reason why this model of integration, of developing integration, is more difficult is related to the negative effects from globalization, something that I mentioned, because indeed, if we look at the public debates in many of the member states, the European Union is being discussed through this issue, to what extent the Union can be an instrument that would enable us to manage some of the negative effects of globalization. The third thing that is also very widely discussed, this is the partial recovery of the national state, not so much as a governance toolkit, but more as an expectation from the point of view of the citizens that the state, the national state, still has the capacity to resolve problems. There are other issues as well. I'm not going to focus on them, but all this range of factors, I believe, is very much connected with the future of integration. I believe we're now entering a period of time where the elites, together with the citizens, the public in the member states, should be trying to have debates I don't want to talk about some utopian models of deliberative democracy. I mean the purely political process that gives different signals to the elites. But when we talk about European integration from now on, through the institutionalization of model that those elites, the elites have, I think that this is way behind us. And I think the new consensus that we need, European consensus, should be agreed upon. It cannot be institutionalized by the political elites, and the key factor for this to happen is related to political leadership. This requires several things: honest interpretation of what is happening, clear explanation about the stakes for all this, and the action or lack of action of the European Union in this situation, and the creation of the next integration effort, not so much based on some grand visions, but on the specific resolution of problems, of issues. And from my perspective, in this context, I think the upsurge of Euroscepticism is not bad news, in as much as it would make, at least, some of the political elites who are already used to developing integration in this way to start rethinking it in order to make the European Union more efficient, but at the same time more legitimate, and keep it, maintain it in this way, and not transform it into an institutional field for implementing anyone's visions about the future. Thank you. As far as I understand, the latest trend is to have some supporting points. I can now wrap up and say that we are filling the gaps in integration, and the crisis showed us how much interrelated we are, and the elites should work with the citizens, should discuss with the citizens, but we don't know whether the debates are the citizens are prepared to debate with the elites. And now let's turn the floor to Mr. Hristev.
To a certain extent, Vlado has made my life difficult. I mean that in panels such as ours, it's good to have opposing opinions. I am one of those who believe that the texts within the EU agreements and belonging to the European idea are quite meaningful, and I have grown up professionally with the logic of this union, and I'd like to believe that the community method, the entire formula, has been exhausted, and we will once again revert to a model of national governments and dominance of certain national interests over other national interests. And the cross point between these positions is key. However, I do believe that the integration system is part of a very bold vision, and it's part of the international relations format. And there is a very low efficiency threshold that is inbuilt into this format. Being a lawyer, I don't believe I can be as original as Vlado, but The issues of foreign policy and security, to me, is part of the existing toolkit, which allows for the decisions to be implemented with the practical outcome of resolving issues which the EU and member states are facing. To me, legitimacy and the very meaning of the existence of the EU is based upon the ability to generate solutions. That is, to resolve critical situations on the backdrop of the common interests of the member states, and secondly, to garner support and acceptance of those solutions on behalf of citizens. I'd like to believe that in its very essence and perception, the EU has not been exhausted. Because the successes of the EU are posited upon the possibility to implement it in various areas to overcome existing deficiencies in effectiveness, and this is not the first time we're facing a situation whereby the European integration system is actually waging a battle for survival. And from the very beginning, the European integration system has been functioning pro-cyclically, overcoming crisis after crisis. I need not dwell on this historically. So, given all the advantages and achievements in integration so far in economics, citizens' rights, and the changes in the very substance of relations amongst states, and let us not forget the primary goal, which is to guarantee a lasting peace in Europe. To a large extent, we may assume or conclude, despite global conflicts, that goal has actually been achieved, or up until now. So it can be considered a success. However, given all the successes of the EU and the attainment of set goals, given the development rates of many parts of the EU which had been lagging behind economically, and these are also successes. And within the context of our panel today, I believe that we need to take into account facts and developments in recent years and try to determine whether the existing models in security and defense can provide any promising answers globally and on European scale. So the guaranteeing of lasting peace and security and retention of the European model of existence of the European states may succeed over time. And in recent years, we have witnessed several major crises. Maybe we can add here the crisis in Georgia, in Syria, and currently Russian-Ukrainian relations. This is actually a relationship between the free world in Europe and Russia. That's how I would interpret it. And for some, this is the proper firing point. So this has to do with foreign policy and, more specifically, defense. So the main issue here is whether useful solutions can be found. I realize that this is very difficult. The need to negotiate and renegotiate amongst 28 member states in a classical situation, such as the situation in the Ukraine, and whether that is a workable model, and whether this can be superseded by overcoming the issue of national states. How can we guarantee the security of our own society if we continue to rely on classical models? At the same time, we have a toolkit which, to my mind, clearly showed in Libya that there are serious problems with the EU and the member states and their defense capabilities, and the extent to which they can maintain a response force. Now, let us take what France and the UK did with their partial participation. They have the largest armed forces, the largest percentage of GDP devoted to defense. Roughly 2/3 of all defense expenditures come from these two countries. And they maintained a military operation against a not very serious opponent. And here we're not taking into account even the logistics which the United States was providing. And we clearly saw that happen in Syria. Such an operation proved to be impossible. Adequate responses were impossible. On the one hand, because of the political positions of the member states, and secondly, because of the inability to conduct any policies without the approval of the United States. So this structural issue is very clearly seen now with the crisis situation in the Ukraine. Regardless of how much we would like to be diplomatic, the Ukraine, which is part of old Europe, part of Europe, with its claims to be the very core of civilization, has been the object of gross violations of international law, interference in the internal affairs of a sovereign state by another state, and this is a sovereign state regardless of what parts of the population are striving for. And years ago, these territories have become part of the sovereign state of the Ukraine with its armed forces and so on and so forth. And we're clearly witnesses to without any responses or positions, there has been no adequate backlash on the part of the EU. And across the borderlines, we see a very aggressive action. And we are facing a classical use of force. So, what are the guarantees that would stop the use of force or that would alleviate or contain the impact of the use of aggression? And now comes the big issue I would like us to discuss today. Could the EU, can the member states consider that they have adequate guarantees to ensure their security, to guarantee their free societies, especially for countries in Eastern Europe and Bulgaria in particular, or maybe they are incapable of doing that? And if that is so, do we have any adequate guarantees that the NATO member states can rely on. And if we follow up on the budget, it seems 3/4 of the military capabilities of NATO are due to the United States. And so the security guarantees for Europe and the elimination of classical risks to security rely on that support. And what are the grounds, for instance, in Article 43, Para 7, which envisage greater integration and a common European defense system. And because of all that, should we not revert to a very old idea, as frequently happens in the development of the EU? Perhaps we should go back to the vision of a consolidated defense structure of the European Union and creation of a single structure. The member states of the EU, according to 2012 data, are spending 190 billion euro to maintain their national budgets, which is 40 billion above the budget of the EU. But these are independent structures, so and the impacts are very different. We would have a very different impact if that defense capability is unified, if there is a single European armed forces with common components of a security system. For instance, common logistics, communications, intelligence, surveillance. We saw that there were serious problems with the fuel for fighter planes, and there can be other technological solutions. And even though we may be pacifists, but when somebody comes in and tells us you either do that or it will be over and done. In actual fact, this is the big issue, because otherwise we're facing gross inefficiencies. So that's the issue I'd like to table. Well, you've already found out that we'll be asking more questions than providing answers, but that's the very purpose of a debate. And I myself have several questions to pose. I don't expect you to provide the answers right now. They're more like food for thought. As Christo has said, I'm just reminded to what an extent the European Union can provide adequate responses to midgets like Libya, and how inadequate its responses are politically when we have a major threat such as Russia, when we're resolving the crisis in Syria, where we also have Iran as a major player. And this once again brings up the issue of the political midget, which is capable of resolving only minor crises. Now, we also mentioned a common foreign policy, and I was thinking of the 10 years which it took to produce something which was supposed to be called a constitution, but ended up being a Lisbon Treaty. And everybody was saying now we have one phone number which Kissinger can use to call us. But that didn't happen because Obama is calling Merkel and a whole range of other politicians. So the question is the Lisbon Treaty dead when it comes to common foreign policy? And also, given the Euroscepticism, is it possible to be talking about a common foreign policy, or perhaps we should create a new Lisbon or whatever treaty in order to deal with our common foreign policy? The answer here will be found, I believe, in the next subtopic which we are going to discuss, and that is energy dependency. President Obama has said something very meaningful in Brussels at the time of the EU-USA summit some weeks ago. He said that the EU is highly dependent, whereas the United States has a very different agenda. So the message was, well, get on with it and deal with it. So can we speak of a common European policy? And given the situation we're in, could we be more prone to embrace the community? The purpose of my speech here is precisely that, to say whether there is such a policy, and if it's lacking, how can we overcome that void. I was listening to Vlado and Christo, and I was thinking of an adage in energy which says that energy relations are like those between spouses. They're very expensive and very hard to deal with. So this has become very clear within the EU, because the member states are defending their energy interests with zeal. And there was a sort of a prenuptial agreement which was signed, which is called the Energy Charter, between the energy users and energy producers. And that charter insisted that security of supplies would be upheld, that there will be no monopoly position abuses, and that there will be transparency and dialogue with the countries which actually are key creditors of energy. So with one meaningful exception, most countries subscribed to this agreement. Russia was the exception, and it opted out because they knew that they will always be in a negotiating position rather than dominant position or determinant factor. So the Energy Charter, which was not signed by Russia, was not a problem until 2004. And security of supplies, problems in energy security were not wrecked by problems. Now, I will be talking primarily about natural gas because the oil markets are liberalized, they're regulated. Same is true of coal markets, but natural gas markets are quite different. We have regional markets, and bilateral exchanges are very important because we have a mix of political, military, social, and other aspects. We have a lot of issues which are not purely trade issues. So the prices of natural gas were quite low, and they were calculated on the basis of oil indexation. So when oil is cheap, then gas was cheap. And the producer countries determined the pricing because they had to compete to win over clients. So Russia, Norway, Algeria, Qatar, the Arab countries did not have a lot of choice. They had to take into account what the demand was. So they had to ensure that there is security of supplies. They had to negotiate with the transiting countries in order to have an uninterrupted flow. Around 2003 and 2004, the situation changed because oil prices went up substantially, partially because of U.S. interference in Iraq. And then there was talk in Europe of a common energy policy. A continental policy was being built up in the 15 preceding years, but such a policy vis-a-vis the outside world was non-existent, and all of a sudden European countries realized that energy could become a very pricey commodity, and in particular because energy is a substantial component in any economy, it would affect the livelihood of citizens, because it had to do with electricity supply and so forth. So steps were taken to boost the dialogue, community dialogue, on the guarantees for the energy market within Europe, so that Europe would have a common vision about energy and therefore negotiate with producers outside of Europe in a much easier way. So that's where the crux of the matter is. The European Commission overlooked that because there were big corporations talking to other big corporations rather than government-to-government negotiations or unions of states or associations of states with other associations of states. So the energy flows, which are key to the functioning of a state strategically, left many corporations to believe that they were the major movers. But the European Union said, no, we have to have a common policy, and many of the big corporations in Europe said, no, we'll do whatever is profitable for us, including the large corporations in Germany and in Italy, Gaz de France in France, and many more. They all had their strategic economic relations with partners in Norway, Russia, and Algeria. And these partnerships were based on long-term cooperation, clear-cut contracts, which were beneficial to both parties. However, as prices went up, the price of oil, the price of natural gas also increased. And it turned out that the producers had an advantage because they could impose their own conditions, because they had a concentration of resources and they could gain the upper hand in pricing in negotiating with the EU member states. And that's why we had the crisis in 2006 in the Ukraine. That was the first signal, the first alert about the need for a change. So as soon as the Ukraine could not pay up its debt, Russia decided that it could show everyone that Europe needs Russia far more than Russia needs Europe. And at that point in time, the European Union did not respond. It failed to do anything of substance except the second gas directive, which aimed at liberalizing the internal market, but it intended to liberalize relations with Norway, Russia, and Algeria. Let us not forget that Algeria and Norway are key to the EU energy supply. So the liberalization failed. And a couple of years later, we had the same crisis revisited. This time, however, Europe realized, especially in Central Europe, realized what it means to have its gas supply cut off, and at what price they would be buying an alternative source of energy and the necessary quantity. So then we have the third liberalization package, which was far more aggressive in meddling in the internal policies of the member states. It had a large-scale liberalization of the market and transparency in contracting relations. Why do I say transparency? Because now government could not interfere using legal or financial instrumentalities. The transmission lines, the distribution could not be meddled with, because that would be a quasi-monopoly. There would be a large demand and high prices. Suddenly, however, a miracle occurred, the economic crisis. happened, and all of a sudden, because there was no economic growth, gas consumption declined. Therefore, these intricate relations with the suppliers were no longer a must. Europe was not so dependent anymore. And countries such as Russia, Norway, and Algeria are highly dependent on natural resources exports. They had to respond to retain their clients in Europe. So how could they do that? Norway, for instance, decided to adapt to the new market conditions. They liberalized the market, they introduced spot pricing and became part of the European family. Algeria and Russia, however, said no, we want our old contracts, high prices for oil, long-term contracts, and where the users will have no choice as to the quantities they can buy, even if they don't need the gas. And at that point in time, we came to this abyss in relations between Europe and the suppliers, and that's why we have this revolution in the United States and gas extraction and new solutions, and then Russia had to start renegotiating prices, reducing prices. But once again, Europe failed to provide an adequate response. It had the opportunity to join forces, to impose its conditions. Once again, bilateral relations took the upper hand. Corporations had their own agreements, their own dependencies and conditionalities they'd agreed to with the suppliers in Algeria and elsewhere, and they did not use their leverage to reduce prices. Now, given what you just said, I think that it would be quite proper to ask, to what an extent would it be possible to create an energy union, and to what an extent would it resolve all these moot issues? The European Energy Union is impossible, unfortunately, at this point in time, precisely because there's major opposition by the big corporations in Europe. And unless this happens, the producer countries will have the upper hand in negotiations. I'm saying this because Gazprom and other companies such as it, because of its structures and its financial might and influences in Europe, can manipulate corporations and governments to retain the long-term contracts. The Polish Prime Minister and the Polish Foreign Minister have always been very critical of dependence on Russia, but Poland is not the country that has the capability and influence to impose such a European energy union. This has to come from the large consumers, Italy and France. And that's where Gazprom's major partners are. I do not believe that this is possible. German companies were against sanctions because they have long-term contracts with Russia up until 2025. And if sanctions are imposed, then they will be taken to arbitration around the world and they will be sued. So what can be done? We can circumvent Russia and look for alternatives. To circumvent Russia would mean that we would maintain a certain level of relations which harken back to the 1970s when the Soviet Union existed, but at the same time we need to seek ways for diversification. And one of these options is the southern gas corridor from the Caspian Sea and other countries in the Middle East and their natural resources. Liquefied gas is another option. Take, for instance, Qatar and new producers such as the United States as of 2016. Australia, Canada are further options. But Europe rarely speaks about this, and even when this is mentioned, it's thought of in political terms rather than economic terms, rather than bringing together companies and their engineering staff and think of diversification, because diversification is very expensive. Prices will not go down. Perhaps prices will go up initially, but there will be supply security. And in the long term, these are factors which will impact prices. Prices will go down in the long term. Then there is another key component here, and it has to do with shale gas. Europe has huge shale gas resources. Unfortunately, policies regarding shale gas are very negative. Legally, socially, Europe is different from the United States. In the United States, there is approval, and everybody is entitled to do prospecting for shale gas on their own territory. In Europe, that is impossible. And unless Europe realizes that it truly needs options and it should not be dependent in its politics on private economic or foreign economic interests. And I know that this is an alien topic for Bulgaria, but if policies are taken over by foreign interests, there will never be any actual diversification and energy security. There are many countries believe that Russian energy supplies are secure enough. So I now suggest that we move on to an aspect which has dominated European foreign policy, that is the export of values. And that was the driving force behind European foreign policy, to use soft methods to re-educate people. And now, given the fact that the European flags which were brandished on the Maidan in Kiev have been left without any response, it's worthwhile thinking about the capability of the EU to export values and to use that diplomatic tool. I'm sure you will have many questions to ask, so please jot them down, and then we'll move on to the next panelist. So, has the European policy of values exportation actually died?
I will try to present my views. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk on behalf of Blueprint. I think this debate is really very needed here in Bulgaria just before the European elections, and unfortunately we can't have it on the political level. I'll start my presentation by going back to 1991. Slovenia and Croatia separated from Yugoslavia. There were military actions in Yugoslavia, and when the foreign minister of Luxembourg, Jacques Bloss, stepped on Slovenian land for negotiations, he said, ironically, that this is the time for Europe, the hour of Europe. And he saw a chance in this conflict that the European Union becomes a key player on the international scene. But unfortunately, this did not turn out to be so. The European Union was powerless in this conflict, and we saw the discrepancy between the potential of the European Union in foreign policy and the expectations of the international players and the citizens, and that's why the European Union, we said that it's European Union is a giant, economic giant, but foreign policy dwarf. So we have to see how things will develop, whether this perspective for the European Union is still relevant. In terms of economy and resources, despite the crisis, the problems with the euro, insecurity, youth unemployment, and all the rest, the European Union remains the most powerful economy in the world. It's the largest common market, 5 million people, and 500 million people, and the wealthiest consumers, as we heard in the first panel. So economically, things are pretty clear. Politically, and from the perspective of foreign policy, how can we compare to the 90s? How things have developed since then? First, we have expansion of the member states. We have now 28 member states, and this brings in additional weight in foreign policy. Delina mentioned the Lisbon Treaty in the context of foreign policy. I think it's not actually the end, it's a step forward in the context of the common foreign policy, and with this treaty, the external action, the European Office for External Action was established, which actually is in charge of the relations of the European Union with third countries. And it's not only that foreign policy is not just one of the pillars of interaction, but it's intertwined with the legal entity of the Union, and there are procedures, mechanisms through which the Union can cooperate, can act. Also, regarding the soft methods, this is something that I can jokingly say the carrot and rod policy. The European Union is successful in imposing conditionalities for countries and giving a carrot without threatening those countries with a rod. So whether we talk about trading agreement, any other thing, but this is extremely effective mechanism. I will give examples later on. This is proven to be most effective for countries that want to join the European Union at some point, or to interact with the European Union, and also the intermediacy between Kosovo and Serbia. When Kosovo declared independence, nobody thought that in April 2013 they will sign an agreement recognizing their mutual jurisdiction, and with this agreement they negotiated not to prevent each other from achieving Euro integration. So this is one of the results of the foreign European Union foreign policy, and also the so this is the positive thing in the development of the foreign policy of the European Union, and we're now in the process of formulating European policy. We're at an early stage. Maybe we haven't progressed as much as we wanted to, but it's much better than 20 years ago. So the European Union provides better opportunities for its political influence. But of course, this has its risks. The 28 member states. For those member states, it means that the foreign policy can be actually the kind of a simple average between the interests of the interests of the individual member states, and this process of coordination, regulation, which cannot be avoided in a democratic in the democratic order, but in times of crisis they delay our responses, and sometimes responses look inadequate. Regarding the expectations from the European Union, they're not as high as in the 90s and the past decade, when many countries joined the European Union, including Bulgaria. The only players on the international scene that have more or less high expectations of the European Union, these are the candidate countries, and not all of them, and also the countries from the Eastern Partnership, including Ukraine. And now shifting the focus from those discrepancies between potential expectations to the values. When we opened this venue, Mr. Stoichev mentioned a crisis of values. We should remember that the European Union is built upon values stipulated in the treaties, democracy, rule of law, protection of human rights, so on and so forth. But I want to look at them not just as hollow phrases, beautifully formulated in the international treaties, but it's the ways through which the European Union can project its economic power into political influence on the international scene. In the past years, the European Union has been dealing with its own problems, but in this actually was detrimental for the for upholding those values. This upholding was it lagged behind. So if we talk about international relations as balance of powers, as a win-lose situation, probably this is what we're going to have after all. It's difficult when you have someone come with a rod and threaten you. You will feel threatened for your own security. But is it realistic to expect the European Union to be a military power, having in mind the fact that we're talking about 28 member states, and some of them are NATO members as well? I think it's realistic to expect the European Union to be a leader, to be influential in other areas. I don't think we should follow this conservative, realistic view about win and lose situations. This is what we were hearing about in the context of Ukraine. This is not in the interest of the European Union. It's not in the interest of the European Union to think of the international environment in this way. The European Union can be a key player if it upholds key issues on the international agenda, the way it did it in the 90s, in the countries that joined the European Union. This should be restored. It should continue. The values should be protected, should be upheld. The fact that there are many players on the international scene that do not think that the annexation of Crimea is a violation of international law. It's just a historical process. This is just happening. This is very much threatening, and it poses high risks. We have to restore the spirit of international cooperation in the context of global issues like climate change, we forgot about this successful outcomes of international cooperation, like the Montreal Protocol. We haven't been hearing about the ozone hole lately, and this is because of this international agreement that was signed by many countries that bans substances that damaging the ozone layer. We have to abide to adhere to the international law, to the WTO, other supranational organizations. The European Union should protect human rights, especially in the chart of the context of the fundamental rights chart. And it's as valid as the treaties. And there's another important issue that's been transforming into political influence, issue posed by the European Union. And this is the consistent policy of the European Union to repeal death punishment, death sentence. And 40 countries so far have repealed have abolished death sentence, and this is a liberal humanitarian cause, which actually makes the other international players perceive the Union in a specific way. This is what should be after. We should be after. Another thing is the digital. After the revelations of Slogan and Snowden and WikiLeaks, we maybe today what we're hearing sounds like science fiction, having in mind the real threats in Bulgaria and also the European Union. But these are issues to be developed in the future, and these are issues that will determine the international order in the future. We're making steps in this direction, like the decision of the Court of the European Union, the European Court of Justice, and also I should say that these are new realities that we have to adapt to. We have to be able to regulate. So it's very much up to the European Union to be a leader in this respect, not to be not try to catch up with the others. Also, this there will be new ways of making decisions. These are the challenges of our modern life, and all those issues provide a possibility to project the economic power of the European Union into to transform this power into political influence. So if the European Union addresses those challenges, then the question when is the hour of Europe will have a this question will have a positive answer. Well, thank you for your attention. From the point of view of the fact that the European Union is perceived as a process, not a project, ready project, yes, we can talk about the balance between pessimism and optimism in terms of what we have achieved and what we can still achieve. And also there are a lot of opportunities lying in front of us when we're talking about the carrot and the rod, the economic projection of the economic power of the European Union. I remember the Greek case that actually has caused turbulence in Europe. There was a debate in the European Parliament before they closed their session and the election campaign. A Greek member of the European Parliament said that the European Union has run out of carrots. Now there's only rods, having in mind what's happening to Greece now. So maybe we have to be thinking in the context of how those rods can be taken out of the European Union to project this economic power. So we are prepared to answer your questions. It's very interesting because we are asking you questions and not you asking questions to us. So I would rather expect from you ideas, comments, answers, and of course if you have questions, you try to answer your questions. So it's over to you now. Don't forget to introduce yourselves. Thank you. My name is Josef Abramov, and I'm a financial analyst. How do you see the future trading agreement between the US and the European Union in the context of the emancipation of the European Union towards the US? Having in mind the fact that the negotiations have continued too long, obviously this is not going to happen by the end of the mandate of this European Commission. Probably this will happen in 2 years' time. And what will be the benefits and the losses for the EU member states after this contract is signed? By the way, I welcome this idea. So who are you asking? Well, Mr. Shapov. And my second question, I heard an interesting idea which has been around for some years. Military forces from the European Union, about the military forces of the European Union. What is the prospect? Because this issue is not being discussed right now. Thank you. I'm not an expert. Maybe I will disappoint you with my answer, but they're different topics, and we at least follow the diplomatic history of negotiations, and we can see several things. Most of them, at least those that are publicly discussed, they are concerns rather, in as much as now the political community has openly supported this trading agreement with the US. Well, actually, those who support this, they're very few. And there is not very confident support of this agreement, but I think there are several problems that need to be resolved in order to make this agreement a reality. And they're connected to this type of leadership that we need in order to make such integration steps. The first problem is the level of perception, because we cannot discuss the contents of the agreement. So the first problem is connected with the insecurity in many of the member states that this agreement would actually contribute to the import of an economic model from the US to Europe. To what an extent this is true, I cannot comment in detail, but the second problem, which I believe exists, and this is connected with the way in which the single market is presented and defended, and its expansion as well. There's a high level of insecurity and political unwillingness to actively motivate, justify the benefits from the single market and its expansion. If we look at the political rhetoric at this election campaign, the only group that are unequivocal in their rhetorics, these are the European liberals. So this is also something that needs to be overcome as a perception. So the idea about the single market should be again defended, and its expansion as well. And in particular, this agreement is part of this liberal agenda. And of course, lastly, the most widely discussed topic, maybe Christo can explain better than me. This is this provision that allows corporations to sue governments for lost opportunities. I read a lot of things. I don't know whether I read enough, but I haven't seen this clause, this provision. But I know there's an emerging practice in Canada and in the U.S. Attempts to initiate such court trials. I haven't, but from what I've seen, I can't imagine how this agreement can really become a reality if this clause, as presented, this provision, remains in the agreement. This is what I can say.
Благодаря.
I would like to dwell on something contained in the first question about this agreement. The problems are two-pronged. First, it has to do with international agreements and sources of legislation. They would entail a specific outcome which would influence the processes. If there is such an agreement, and if EU-US trade is liberalized, then that would curtail the maneuverability of the European legislator on a whole range of issues for years to come. Therefore, it has a democratic legitimacy issue. The question is, how can you enter in such a large-scale agreement, and would that deprive the legislative body within the EU to influence many sectors for years to come? And then Vlado dwelled on a number of aspects, and the truth is that within the EU, private companies may lodge claims nationally or within the EU for opportunity costs is key, because it is associated with a very sensitive aspect. The European Court has a certain practice as far as the influence of private corporations to influence EU legislation is very restrictive, because this is a practice typical of American companies. On the other hand, international agreements cannot be protested in the regular courts. I've tried to fit within the 5 to 7 minutes I was allocated, and it was difficult. So if you play by the rules, you're usually at a loss. So that's why I will try to further explicate my position. Now, Martin mentioned the actual facts having to do with the energy market, and Velislav mentioned some of the successes of the EU, such as asserting democratic models, democracy, human rights clauses, and all that. But even though we may hope that the EU has progressed immensely in its humane growth, if we look at what is happening in Syria, what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, we know that it is evil. But take a look at Europe. We're not talking about strange relations, about countries which are in the periphery. We're talking about a country with a classical set, using a classical set of military intervention to intervene in a sovereign state to annex parts of its territory, and at the same time the European Union is deliberating endlessly, coming up with this sophisticated formulations, how it's going to impact, and where are its responses about these values? Is the European Union helping these people who rose up to defend their democratic rights? How is it doing this? The EU is listening to what its gas companies are saying. It is giving up models which have been created years ago. Yes, there have been positive examples in implementing its mission. That's the general assessment. There are temporary response forces which have been used, rapid response forces, but these are troops who do not have a lot of capability. They don't have the technology. And if you take a look at the operations they've taken, they've primarily participated in because they've used the infrastructure and command structure of NATO or as part of the UN forces. So where is the real issue? Well, there is a real question here. If the EU builds up its own defense forces, would that be a threat to NATO? This is something that's been debated for many years. No, I don't believe that the United States are making a huge effort to retain the status quo within NATO. The U.S. administration and President Obama himself have said on many occasions that there are problems with military planning, military expenditures, and that the United States cannot endlessly assume additional commitments to NATO. And at the same time, NATO are cutting down on their military expenses, because that is the fact of the matter. We have an issue with classical, simple, straightforward security and realistic threats to the EU and the member states. And those who guarantee the security of these states are the United States. And NATO and its military structures cannot shoulder the burden endlessly. That's why I have posed the issue. And although this is a difficult debate, it has to be conducted within the EU, because they failed to see the red light when events took place in Libya. They failed to see that after Syria, and we have to finally realize that we have a serious issue with guaranteeing long-term stability in the existence of the EU beyond national or economic interests. Given the current state of affairs, we cannot have any certainty that security will be guaranteed. We have beautiful documents and pretty phrases in the EU, but time and time again, we have to face the issue of security and survival. Questions?
Аз искам да попитам нещо. Добрин Станев. Въпросът ми е към господин Владимиров.
Addressing this to Mr. Vladimir. What about the gas pipelines? They're good and bad pipelines. They're pro-European and anti-European pipelines. They're, one of these pipelines is called North Stream, the other one is called South Stream. One is a fact, and the other one is still a pipe dream. So why does the European Union support Nord Stream, and why is it castigating South Stream? Why is Commissioner Oettinger saying that one energy package should be applied to South Stream, and then it should not be applied to Nord Stream, and there should be derogations? Why are there double standards in the energy field? I do not believe that there are good or bad pipelines. There are pipelines which are logical and pipelines which are illogical. And Nord Stream and South Stream are both illogical because both pipelines are economically non-feasible because they're too expensive, and their construction exceeds by far standard costs for such pipelines. Secondly, their function is not to transport more gas. Their main function is to circumvent the Ukraine. And why is the European Union using double standards? That is because in Nord Stream we had different types of politicians and companies participating, and in South Stream we have a different set of participants. And the other reason is that when Nord Stream was being planned, the gas consumption in Europe was expected to increase by 60 billion per year. Now, when South Stream appeared on the map, the economic crisis had already set in, and it was obvious that Europe will not need those quantities of gas in the next 10 years. That is why South Stream is a pipeline which will transport 63 billion is madness, and all the gas that transits through Ukraine would be channeled to South Stream, and this does not serve the geopolitical interests of the EU and the interests of the United States. When I'm talking about foreign policy, I'm a little more radical, and when I say EU foreign policy, I also am thinking of the US foreign policy by other means. So the circumvention of the Ukraine and its energy isolation are a geopolitical failure of the European Union, of the West of Europe. That is US, EU, and Western partners. So now that the Ukraine is suffering a quasi-civil war, the South Stream pipeline will be the last straw, because if Gazprom re-channels its 20 billion gas to North Stream, you have 50 million euro losses per year. And the losses, if South Stream becomes operational, will be even larger than this. Still, imagine we have North and South Stream. This means that Gazprom can switch off the gas supply to the Ukraine whenever they deem necessary, whenever they want to change the government there. They do it today as well, but they have to pay a price, because if they stop the gas to the Ukraine will shut down supplies to the EU, and Gazprom will lose its key client, which is the European Union. So the European Union, by being dependent on Gazprom up to 30%, does not need to become even more dependent on Gazprom. You cannot expect that South Stream will provide gas at a cheaper price if these contractual conditions become effective. As I've said in my introduction, there are bilateral relations between corporations in Europe and Russia. And the key partner of Gazprom is Eni, who have a strategic agreement which they renewed in 2011. So they built Blue Stream, another illogical pipeline. Eni also has prospecting rights for natural gas in Russia. Eni purchases about 30% of gas for local consumption in Italy. All these are arguments in favor of Eni not reneging on its contractual obligations. And that is why these European elections are far more important than ever before, because it's important whether left or right will win these elections, and that will predetermine the fate of South Stream. I do believe that if the European People's Party wins, they will have an impact on South Stream and North Stream. Well, we can leave that issue of the last straw aside. Yes, but this is just the first step. So now we have time for one more question. Yulia Zakharieva, I am a professor. Perhaps you will say that clearly. I will try to clarify certain issues. I will break Christo's dream. What he has said, this will not happen. There will be no European defense community. The agreement was signed in 1952 because that was at the time of terrifying threats to security. We had the Korean War, the situation in Europe, we had the Cold War in its classical model, and nothing happened, although there was an agreement signed. So that is not the proper direction to move in, but why not dream about it? I have a question for Mrs. Marini. Why are you using such threatening words like coffins, last straws? No, I didn't say it. I just... Well, you asked whether the Lisbon Treaty was dead. Then you asked something else and you used the word dead again. So what did we expect from the Lisbon Treaty in the common security and foreign policy? What were our expectations to ask whether it's died? So changes in this area are very few, regardless of institutional window dressing. Specialized secretariat within the Council of Ministers. Now we have the Foreign Affairs who are supporting the High Representative for Foreign Policy, institutional window dressing. And this high representative for foreign and security policy is there. And if Kissinger were going to use a phone number, it does not entail from the Lisbon Treaty, but from the Amsterdam Treaty. They said that that telephone was being set up because the Americans are dumb and they cannot remember who is the president in council because they rotate every 6 months. Whether this is effective or not, I don't know. But after Lisbon, we have a common European and security policy, and this is something that is being decided by the Council of Ministers. So the maximum that can be achieved is to coordinate foreign policy. The fact that it says common foreign policy in the treaty, this is just a pipe dream. Perhaps one day this will happen, but European jargon often uses terms which are devoid of substance. And why do you like this cliche so much? Economic giant and political midget. I think I'm dwelling on memories too much, but this is a cliche which emerged at the end of the 60s, and it referred to Germany. That's what it was then, an economic giant with its hands tied behind the back. We had two Germanys and boundaries passing through people's backyards. Why are we using the same tried phrase to define the European Union? And if you use it, somebody would say, by gosh, what a midget. So the EU is not a midget. I have a question now, and I don't know whether we'll have time for it. Vladimir Shapov made a very interesting presentation. So you said that this is not the model. Bring together the elites, draft a project. The Constitution was written in 18 months. 18 months. And 94 they signed off on it. But what other model is there? We keep saying that we need to bring together sovereign states. Is there another toolbox that we could use to ensure that unification other than international agreements? Are you suggesting a different approach or what? Very interesting questions and comments. The majority of them were addressed to me, and now with relation to the Lisbon Treaty and what is the source of this single phone number. No, I did not use that for this purpose. It is a cliche, but that was one of the mottos for the Lisbon Treaty. And everyone, I think, remembers the quest for various ways to put it in concise format so that more people would vote in favor of it in order to avoid another stumbling block to integration. Let us not forget that 18 countries had already ratified the Constitution. 2 countries were definitively against it, and we couldn't find out what the rest would have done. So there was a very difficult task at hand. Those had not ratified the Lisbon Treaty had to say, well, this is the same treaty. Because when a sovereign state ratifies a document, that is a very serious effort. And at the same time, efforts were made to suggests that this was a very different document. That's why I use this phrase, to provoke interest, because this is part of the European debate, and the purpose of any debate is to take the next step. And that's why I asked whether this treaty is dead. In the European Parliament, there are many MEPs who say that the Lisbon Treaty has been exhausted with a view to its ability to complete the integration. So in this sense, the Lisbon Treaty has obviously hit the ceiling of expectations. We have to balance here between expectations and capabilities. Indeed, this is a cliché about the midget or dwarf, but it's very evocative, and I am not in love with it, but decision makers have used that in a context which I find to be valid as of date. Other than that, I have no preferences for this metaphor. I don't know whether I'll be able to respond in kind. I was not talking about the legal aspects of the issue. I was talking about the practices in goal-setting within the European process. If we're looking for a contrast, and the ontology contrast, we need to focus on the way in which the banking union is being set up. Now, there was a dream of European unity, and that dream was implemented, maybe partially. It had to do with the monetary union, but the banking union in itself is a daily negotiation amongst governments and seeking a balance between what is necessary, what is acceptable, and what is affordable in order to achieve it. So, given this legitimacy issue, that's what European integration should look like. What I suggested was not a value judgment of integration. It was an analysis, an analytical review. And if I were to provide more details, I would say that the banking union today looks very different. Actually, it alters every few months. Certain elements are added, others are omitted. Initially, there were to be 3 pillars, then one of the pillars turned out to be completely unacceptable. And then there is a group of countries who are saying that the banking union is not complete. There are major omissions in it, and there are others who are criticizing the first 2 pillars. So what I tried to do was to provide a bird's eye view of the processes of integration, taking into account the need to accommodate fears, threats, hesitations of all Europeans. Now, given the model of integration, which was introduced 15 years or 20 years ago, would not work for us today, I suggest that we move to close the debate, I would like to say something. This defense plan will not be affected, but there are certain elements of common planning and logistics do exist. And many of those present here perhaps know that there have been lessons learned. For instance, the steps which were taken after the Libyan crisis was this common European aircraft system. Perhaps after the crisis in the Ukraine, there will be a joint European project for unmanned aerial vehicles. So there will be other such projects about communication, intelligence, which can be implemented over time, step by step, because integration is developing incrementally. We can all study at very prestigious universities, amass our certificates and use beautiful phraseology, but over time this will not be legitimate publicly, and it will be just academic research. I would like to say something about the EU armed forces. The United States of America did not emerge overnight. And before they emerged, as we know them today, each state had its own army, had its own bank, had its own laws. But because of the crisis in their relations with the United Kingdom, they had to unite and resolve the problem, and decided that the colonies could only survive if they were united. So what is happening within the EU is a process, and we should not really try to accelerate it, because integration takes time, and the European Union is the living proof of that since its creation. Now, whether we're going to have a single defense or foreign policy, this will be determined by international relations as well, and whether the United States, as the one who holds the dominant position, it will have a major competitor, because when it comes to security, then these will be two competing forces. And that's one of the determining factors of having a common security and defense policy. The banking union, the integration in the Eurozone has been catalyzed by what happened in Greece, and the reforms which are happening very quickly within the EU is because of the urgency of the situation. So if there is a new foreign policy emergency, then we may see changes in foreign policy within the context of greater unity. I regret the fact that I cannot take any more questions, but we are really lagging behind. And in Facebook, all those who have questions that have not been taken up will be able to address those questions, so we can continue the debate that way. Obviously, we all have more questions than answers, so please join us on Facebook.